Welcome to Book Time with Ryan. I am Ryan, and today I'll be talking about The Robin Hood Guerrillas by Pablo Brum. The epic journey of Uruguay's Tupamaros. And I am wearing Capitan Miranda from Uruguay. It's their training ship. I got this when they were visiting Baltimore. I have had this book for a while, but recently the Uruguayan president, Mujica, died, and he's in this book, so I finally decided to read it. Let me tell you that I knew a little bit about Tupamaros, but didn't really have more of the context behind where they came from and what came out of kind of their rise. I had a co-worker whose father worked for the U.S. government and was in Uruguay. They got some kind of heads up that he was going to be targeted, and he left, and then somebody else was killed that looked like him, and they don't know if that's why or what. But it was a very violent time, and it was the 60s and 70s, mid to late 60s, early 70s, early to mid 70s. And it is an uprising of really more of a middle class socialist arm of Uruguayan politics, but kind of external from the politics. This was a time period where you saw the Castro brothers rise in Cuba, Che Guevara going around, kind of rallying the cause in South America. There was a lot of turmoil, governments kind of flipping between totalitarianism, nationalism, and socialism, communism. A lot of stuff going on here. And Uruguay was not an exception, although it kind of was. It was less extreme in Uruguay. Uruguay already had a pretty firm democratic republic or socialist republic or some kind of fairly democratic system, less difference between classes, although there were still the haves and the have-nots. About half of the population in Uruguay, about a couple million, are in the capital, Montevideo, and the rest are inland. And this really focused more on urban guerrilla warfare. And still, like, when you're thinking guerrilla warfare, it was less extreme than what you were seeing in a lot of other countries. So people did die. There was torture. There were kidnappings, bombings, but not to the same level, not the same kind of numbers you saw in other countries around this time. This book looks at the rise of the Tupamaros, the key figures, including Mujica, their rise and the response, and their fall, and kind of the fallout from Tupamaros' time in the community. At one point, I mean, we're looking at thousands of people. And I asked a relative, how prevalent was this in that time period? Somebody who was there. And they said that it was happening, but it wasn't everywhere. They weren't affected directly by it. I had this picture in my mind after reading this that, like, it was just a city in chaos and everyone was looking around and over their shoulders, and that maybe it wasn't quite that. But I think even if you had a few hundred kidnappings, that would be fairly alarming, especially in a city that probably wasn't used to that. So their causes, I also should say I'm not pro-guerrilla. I'm not a socialist. I think there are other ways to solve differences. Even Mujica, once he became president, or before he became president, he also talked about how he thinks their approach was a mistake and that there are ways to reach out to everyone in the country. And I think that's true. You look at it and you're like, well, there's a cause. But when you rob a bank and you put people at risk, when you rob a car, when you kidnap somebody, those people are traumatized. And even if you have this idea that you're doing it for some good cause, you're doing evil. So not a good situation. The Tupamaros really start to rise. They had all these kind of Robin Hood acts where they would go in and steal guns for their cause or money, and the money that they got that were really for the lower income people or middle class, they would return to the bank, and the money from the kind of aristocracy, the higher ups, they would keep. And there was a lot of stuff like that early on that got them some support in the community. Still not a lot of support, but enough support for it to be alarming. And then they started to slip. A number of the Tupamaros were arrested, and the police force and eventually the military also tortured them, used some very extreme measures to get more and more information out of them. The Tupamaros also responded by being more and more violent. They started executing people, targeting police, even though police were really just lower class citizens that were just doing a job. And they killed an American in cold blood. They just executed him as they were holding him hostage. Things really blew up. They had a number of jailbreaks too, some pretty amazing jailbreaks. But public opinion started to shift quite a bit, and they were embarrassing a relatively lightly militarized country with a fairly underdeveloped police force, most of which was in Montevideo. The Tupamaros knew, and they were told by Castro and by Guerra, that fighting in a city, guerrilla warfare, urban guerrilla warfare, just would not succeed. And that Uruguay didn't have the geography for guerrilla warfare. They were told it probably wasn't going to work, but they made a lot of things work pretty early. And some of the kind of mapping they had of the sewer systems, the digging they did for different kind of movements between homes or breaking people out of jail or prison. Those are all like pretty interesting things. Even there's a recounting of one of the major jailbreaks, and it was pretty amazing the way they pulled that off. But they weren't good, and the response was also not great. It became more and more brutal as the police force and the military were embarrassed. They took more and more extreme positions. The government really started to back off, first with the President Pacheco, and when he lost, the person who won after him, Bordaberry. The way the Uruguayan elections worked, as my understanding from reading this book, is the parties are elected, then the parties present their top people, and they're voted on again. So there are ways that kind of coalitions can upset who's really popular by having a number of other people on a ticket or on a sheet, electorate sheet. I don't know what it's called. Basically, there's a very controversial election where the most popular person wasn't elected because of the system they have. And Bordaberry was elected. He was weak. He gave more and more power over to the military as he was being embarrassed, and the police force. And eventually what you see is a police force who starts to not only, in the military, that not only targets the Tupamaros, but also any sympathizers with the Tupamaros. They start curtailing freedom of the press, freedom of speech. They go after politicians that speak out against them or that harbor Tupamaros or Tupamaro sympathizers. They go after the judiciary. They take over, and they eventually have this power sharing agreement between the president and the military, but really the military has the power. And they would go on to yield, or go on to, they kept that power for almost maybe about a decade, until 1985 is when it was returned to a president exclusively. And there was a lot of forgiveness for the Tupamaros that were involved, and some of the military and police. It was really kind of a time to back off from what they had dealt with. Now, I don't remember the number of deaths. It was thousands, but it was the author Pablo Brum was quick to point out that in comparison to other socialist uprisings in Latin America, it was tiny and inconsequential, although the Tupamaros were the inspirations for a number of those socialist uprisings and the groups that employed similar tactics, although in many ways those tactics were more extreme in the end too. So you had this military kind of take over, You went from this desire to have a socialist government to a military dictatorship. The Army and the Air Force. Well, really, the Army is the one that kind of led the way in that with a few generals. And the pushback came from the Navy. They said, this is illegal. We're not going to help out. The Navy kind of blockaded Montevideo. And then the Army took over Cerro, a big fort, and aimed guns down on the ships and threatened to sink those ships. Eventually, the admiral backed down, and the coup succeeded. But it was really an Army-led coup that had some help from the Air Force, tiny bit of help from the Navy, but really the pushback was from the Navy, which is nice if you like navies or Coast Guards. So that's why I'm wearing my Capitan Miranda hat from the naval training vessel Capitan Miranda. I enjoyed the book. I thought it was really interesting. I talked to people that would have known about this period, a coworker, family, and I just got a better feeling for what the Tupamaros were and what that movement was, and the backlash from the rise of the Tupamaros and the switch from this country with infighting to a dictatorship for a number of years. And now Uruguay is one of the most stable countries in South America. And I would love to visit it one day, but that's not today. So, good book. Really one of the, I don't know if it's the only telling, but it says it's one of the first, at least, tellings of the Tupamaros in a book in English. So, which I needed, because that's really all I can read. So thanks for being here today. Adios.